I think it's starting. Okay. Welcome, everyone. First, we have a note taker. Dick is going to be taking notes again. So thanks again, Dick. Appreciate that. Um, Roman will not be able to attend today, so we don't have an AD today. If you have any questions about that, or questions related to AD work, let me know, and I'll take it with Roman later on. Okay, let's get going. So again, the not well applies here. So make sure you understand everything is that we say and work on here falls under this not well, the IETF not well too. Today we will be talking about PAR, and I'll in a second hand it to Brian to walk us through this. I just want to mention a draft that Neil just submitted or sent to an email to the mailing list about this specific draft that was part of Jose, I guess. So please take a look, and if you have any comments or any feedback, send that to the list, and we will try to schedule a meeting for this to discuss this document in one of the coming weeks. I'm still waiting for others to see if we can schedule other meetings for those other documents that we have as a working group documents. So that's all I have from my side. Any questions, comments?
I'd like to consider doing one on Depop, but was hoping to get a new draft revision published before, and I'm not entirely sure when that's going to happen. So we can talk offline about it, but if there's a meeting later in the series, maybe that could go towards Depop, that might work well for me anyway.
Yeah, sounds good. Just let me know, and we will try to find the proper time and date and to get this going. Yes. Okay.
All right.
Okay, let me see. Anything else? Anybody else? Any other comments, questions? Okay. Brian, will you be sharing, presenting from your side, or do you want me to present from here? Up to you.
Whatever works better usually, I guess.
I'll give you a shot. Try it and see what.
Okay, let's see. Share content. I think we'd know how to do this by now, but
yep.
That's showing up. Okay.
Yep.
I'm going to start the slideshow here and okay. All right. Awkward transition. Welcome to this interim here. We're dedicating this one to talk about pushed authorization requests. Hopefully there's not too much controversial or new here, but seemed like a good opportunity to sort of touch base on the document and talk about status and next steps. So few sort of half-assed visual puns here in the beginning, and there'll be more of them coming out through the rest of the doc, but let's jump right into it. If I can figure out the right buttons to push to advance. Sorry, there we go. Okay. So just a little context setting. PAR, the pushed authorization request draft, basically introduces this new endpoint at the authorization server, which is the pushed authorization request endpoint. And it allows a client to push the payload of what would otherwise be a normal OAuth 2 authorization request, but push it directly to the AS through a direct connection. And it utilizes the same client authentication mechanisms as you would otherwise normally use at the token endpoint, and now some others as we've seen those developed. What this does is provide the client, in response to the pushed request, the client receives a request URI that's later used as a reference to that authorization request data in a subsequent authorization request sent through the browser using the request URI mechanism defined in JAR. This allows for large authorization requests, and there's a lot of different reasons this might happen. Authorization details coming out of RAR can be rather verbose. The claims parameter from Connect, it can be pretty large. We've seen scopes run amok and JWT encoded state parameters and other things, all of which can kind of come together and cause for significantly larger authorization requests than maybe were first envisioned. And those can and sometimes do run into browser length limitations on URIs. And this pushing it to the authorization server allows for working around that particular issue. The direct client to authorization server HTTPS connection provides integrity and confidentiality protection on the request itself, which is otherwise difficult to come by, possible but difficult. And you get the opportunity to do client authentication and authorization prior to the start of any user interaction, at least for confidential clients, which isn't possible through the normal authorization request mechanism because the client isn't authenticated at that point, it's just identified. So it's a chance to do some checking up front and even check some policy and potentially deny requests earlier on in the process if policy so dictates. Jump in right into the protocol details and see what it looks like. The starts out with the client taking what would be its authorization request parameters and encoding them in the post body of HTTP request to the authorization server. You see here the normal stuff you'd expect: the response type, state, client ID, redirect URI. We did the PXE parameters here just to show sort of newly accepted best practice and scope. And also in this, you'll see that there's a authorization header doing HTTP basic authentication for the client. But all this is happening in a direct request from the client to the authorization server. Assuming all goes well, the authorization server stores off that data somehow internally in an implementation specific fashion, associates it with the request URI value, and returns that value to the client. Just a little bit of JSON, common response type here. The client then turns around and sends that URI to the authorization through the browser, through the front channel, to initiate or actually start that authorization request in the browser just by sending the client ID and the request URI, which the authorization server in turn, remembers the data associated with that URI and is able to initiate the authorization request with the associated data, but in the context of the user and the browser at this point. That's all there is to it. It's relatively simplistic in terms of what it is and what it does, but it's fairly powerful in enabling some improved security in a simplified means for a lot of clients. A little bit of history on this here. It was conceptualized in Nat's mind, I think a long time ago, just never really got written down. And there was a half-hearted subsection about it written in FAPI for a while, but not sufficient to actually provide an interoperable sort of implementation, just some comments that something like this might be possible. A few of us decided that it might be worthwhile or time to write this down in an actual ID internet draft and considered bringing it to the IETF. That was done, and the draft was discussed both at IETF 105 and 106, which gives me the opportunity to jam some pictures of those two locations here. And then right at the end of 2019, it was adopted by the working group as official working group document. I can't read my own stuff here because of WebEx. Okay, here we go. So not a lot has happened since the adoption, but a couple changes here and there. And more recently, we had a draft 02 published earlier in July. And this was coming out with updates based largely on questions and issues that were raised in the last interim on it, as well as a few little list discussions. Some of the larger, if you will, changes, although they're relatively small in the scheme of things, were to add some metadata around policy. So a require pushed authorization requests metadata parameter was added both for the client and authorization server to allow the metadata to express policy for only accepting pushed authorization requests, either in the context of an individual client for the client metadata, or for an authorization as a whole, as a way to indicate that that's the only way it will accept authorization requests. The document was updated to comply with JAR draft 21, which finally settled on requiring the client ID in the authorization request, as well as the request URI. So I was really just filling out some examples to make sure they work together. We added a note regarding this require assigned request object metadata that was introduced into JAR in draft 25. So it's not a functional change to PAR itself, but just noting the applicability of that policy from JAR and how it might potentially apply to, or does apply to, the respective cases in PAR itself. Clarified a little bit of discussion about the timing of request validation. PAR basically says that to the extent possible, you need to do request syntax validation of the authorization request as early as possible in the process, but acknowledges that there are some things that can't be done without actually having the browser there for interaction. So it tries to clarify that you basically do what you can in the back channel and then do the rest through the normal course of processing, and just ensure that all the normal validation does in fact occur, even if it's, regardless of where it happens, and even if it's a little bit redundant that you can't not do validation, but you should try to do validation at the front end. And I'm pretty sure the document says it more eloquently than the mumbling I just did, but that was added there. We added a little bit of guidance and some options around how the AS can structure the request URI. It's all optional and just stuff you can do if it's useful. The AS is still at the liberty of doing the URI, whatever makes sense for it. But we introduced OAuth base URI to be something you could use in place of your own your own value that you make up, and maybe keep some people from making up their own URIs that might not actually be fully correct. And mentioned the possibility of using a UUID as a URN per this RFC that I only recently found out about. It's a little bit old, 4122. It's just a way to encode a UUID as a URN, which works nicely here if you just want to use that to reference the authorization request data. Minor thing, updating a draft to an RFC as was published. And somebody, I forget where, but there's a mention that it's nice, and I agree with this, it's nice to be able to actually do full validation on examples. So we included the key that was used to generate the examples, both public and private portions, just so a reader, if they're so inclined, could validate or recreate the request object signature in the draft and just see that they get the same results or can verify the results. One thing that came up in the last interim meeting or around it was the reality that at the time JAR was pretty clearly stating that the request URI had to refer to a JWT encoding of the authorization request. And we talked a little bit about PAR means that that's not strictly necessary, because the authorization server is basically referring to data of its own keeping. So that requirement was both not validatable and not necessary. And there was some discussion about sort of loosening the requirement with some workaround text in PAR, but the consensus kind of came back to actually fixing it in JAR itself so that there wasn't a requirement that had to be updated or overridden. So just noting here that in JAR, that particular requirement was relaxed a little bit, saying that if the request URI wasn't something that was needed to be interoperable, was something that was entirely within the AS's disposal. It didn't necessarily have to be a JWT. So it's not a change actually to PAR, but a fix to JAR back in draft 22 resolved an outstanding issue that we did have with PAR itself. Probably interchanged JAR and PAR a few times, but hopefully I'm using them in the right context. Sorry, here we are. And not long after the O2 revision, we also pushed out an O3 just a little bit later in July. Mostly really small, minor stuff, kind of clean up and editorial things, and a few things people noted on O2. There's no major wire changes to the protocol. So despite this being a quick turnaround, I think it's actually indicative of a fairly strong, like fairly stable protocol at this point. So there were some editorial updates. One, it was assumed, but now explicitly states that the PAR endpoint must use the HTTPS scheme. We gave a little bit better explanation around the one-time use recommendation for the request URI. A little bit more text, just sort of describing the motivations behind PAR itself, describing how you get integrity, confidentiality, and potentially early client auth in the process. Some of that stuff was sort of implied or assumed, but it's a little bit more explicit now in the draft. I did drop a section on special error response codes for request objects. So there's no, yeah, it's gone now. So it's a more consistent error response handling than it was previously. A little bit of discussion of the potential of using browser form posting to get around the length limitations is a different way than PAR, but the fact that it doesn't always work and that PAR can be used to work around those limitations even for any type of application where the browser post is really only really usable from the perspective of web server type clients. And I clarified the authorization request examples to more clearly say that the client directs the user agent to make the HTTP GET request. I felt like rereading it, there was a little bit of potential confusion about that it might be making the request itself. So tried to clarify that the actual authorization request with the request URI is initiated by the client, but it's done so by the client invoking the user agent to actually make the request. So that went out earlier or the end of last month, and we just mentioned that there are now a pretty significant number of implementations and usages by other SDOs. This is not necessarily a complete list, but these are the ones that I'm aware of, including an implementation I recently did in product myself, and was pleased with the state of the document and the applicability to actual implementation. I didn't run into some of the issues you sometimes hit when you go from draft to implementation. So I think it's in a good place. There's a lot of, and maybe more coming, implementations as well as usages in other SDOs that are making use of it or profiling it for their usage. So generally good news here. And my standard sort of gratuitous closing slide of, in this case, the city of the next likely canceled in-person meeting. I'm guessing we won't see each other in Bangkok, but you never know. And really at this point, I think the action item I'm asking the working group to consider is it time to take PAR to working group last call based on implementation experience and the feedback thus far and the stability of the draft. I think it's ready.
Okay, thanks, Brian. There is a question here in the chat. I'm gonna take a look at that. And yeah, if you anybody wants to comment and questions, please add yourself to the queue.
I could jump the queue for a second, Stick, taking notes. Dennis, what's your last name? If you could type that into the chat.
Dennis, can you hear us? Probably on mute.
Try to call.
Did you hear Dick's question?
Yes, but I can't talk.
Oh, can you type it in the chat?
I will try.
Yes, thank you.
I'm just now getting the chat here. Dick, thanks for your concern. I did want the video on. I'm outside. My family's inside, so I needed to try to get a little quiet. And and I thought it was a nice view. So yeah, thanks for your concern though.
Okay.
I also see one question here.
Exactly, yeah.
It's probably just expedient to go through this. Should the insensitive parameters like prompt also be added to the PAR request, or can it be added in the authorized call? So the idea with PAR is that everything that would otherwise be in the authorization request is sent in the PAR request itself, and then only the URI and the client ID to be compliant with JAR is sent. So yes, everything is sent initially in the PAR request, and only the 2 follow-up parameters are sent in the actual authorized call. Everything else, all the normal parameters or any extension parameters that you might send are all sent initially in the PAR request itself.
Okay, anybody else? Any questions?
Can you hear me right now? Is Dennis speaking?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. So first, the answer to the question. My family name is Pinkas, Pinkas. And at the same time, I have not a question, but basically, at the moment, the draft includes a security consideration section, but it doesn't include a privacy consideration section. And I would appreciate that a privacy consideration section could be added to the draft before the last call. Would it be possible?
It would be possible, yes. I'm not quite sure what would be in there. The latest document does allude to the possibility of PII type information being in the request itself, and the advantages to sending those in the PAR request versus through the browser in the clear, where it might be more likely to be seen by those for whom it was not intended.
No, nothing with that. It has to do with what the authorization server can learn from the client. So what can the authorization server knows everything about what the user will be doing? If yes, it should be said.
So this doesn't change anything about what the authorization server knows regarding the intent of the client relative to any other OAuth flow. It's just a different mechanism for its delivery. So
yes,
it's not. I don't see it as a necessity or even an appropriate piece to relitigate what information is or isn't shared between the client and the authorization server in a narrow extension draft about the method of delivery versus the actual content of the information.
Most of drafts are silent about that. And it's not because they were silent in the past that we should be silent for the future.
Okay, let's, Dick, do you have any comments about this?
Yes, I do. I don't think that this is something I've ever seen in a IETF draft. And so I think that this isn't just isolated to OAuth. This is more of a IETF-wide view around how do we address privacy, similar to quite a while ago, security considerations were added to drafts. And so I would think, our AD isn't on this, but I'd move this up to the AD as to what should we do around this, as opposed to just randomly adding a new section. I don't know. We should make sure that fits in the context of how the IETF is working. Also, just want to confirm the spelling of your name, Dennis. It's Pinkas.
This is correct.
Okay.
So just to pile on a little bit, Dick, there is a I don't know if it's convention or standard or what you want to call it, but some precedent, I guess, for privacy considerations in these documents, IETF wide. So that's not totally out of the realm of, a possibility, but more specifically, that particular relationship, I have some questions about its necessity or appropriateness in this particular document.
Well, which RFCs is privacy considerations in? I just haven't seen them. That doesn't mean that they're not there. I didn't want to set a new precedent here.
No, and I totally agree with that. I know I've written at least one somewhere at somebody else's urging. I don't know offhand. I can certainly find out and let you know after the fact, but I don't have it at the tip of my fingers now. My particular concern here would be more about the particular content of it and relevancy to this document versus a broader set of issues.
Agree. I mean, talking about privacy considerations that are really around all of OAuth doesn't seem appropriate to be in just PAR.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Dick. There's one more question in the list, and I'm not sure what's the name here, the name of that person. But Brian, do you want to take a look at that?
Is it? Yeah, the most recent one. Let's see. I'll just read it just in case. The OAuth 2 spec has both client ID and response type as mandatory parameters of the authorized call, but with PAR, only client ID is mandated along with request URI. Feels like PAR is not being compatible with OAuth 2. Is this a concern that we should look into? It's a fair question, and I guess I would defer then to the work in JAR, which right or wrong took the liberty of saying that those parameters, I guess in this case it's really only the response type that's in question, are not mandatory as query string parameters on the call, but mandatory as it. Sorry, I'm struggling with the wording. The idea is that it's an alternative way to express the same content. So response type is mandatory, but it's mandatory in the initial PAR request itself, and the validation should occur at that point. And then the actual authorization call itself only then takes the response, takes the request URI as a stand-in for the complete set of data. And I suppose in a way I'm sort of punting the question off to saying, well, JAR, which is the JWS rec document, more or less already answered this question by stating only the request URI and client ID are required on the query string at that point in it. So PAR is just building off of that. That was a sort of circular argument, but the state of things, I don't know if that addresses your concerns or at least points you to the place where the particular question was addressed. And to be fair, that's been a lot of debate about whether that is necessary or not, and the relevance to other extensions like the OpenID Connect variation of these same flows, but that's ultimately where JAR landed, and PAR just builds on that. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other comments, questions? Okay. So Brian is asking for a WIC rule blast call. So I would like to know, besides the authors, how many people actually read the draft. So if you've read the draft, please add +1 to the chat there, just to get a feeling of how many people read it. Okay. Okay, good. Awesome. Good. Okay.
And I would just note, there's obviously been, based on the running code slide here, there's been people outside of the working group too, and other SDOs that have obviously read it as well, just based on implementation and use. So
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, good point. Okay, anybody has any concerns with starting a working blast call on this document? Seems like fairly mature document. Any concerns? Okay. Well, I think I don't see any objections here.
great.
So we will start a new work group last call on this one soon enough. Right? Somebody else want to jump in here? Sorry.
That's Dick as note taker. I saw the +1s. I didn't quite catch what the question was. +1s on the chat.
Oh, regarding who read this draft.
Okay. Was there volunteers to review it?
So that's going to be part of the work group last call. No, we haven't called for that.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
But that's a good point. So can we get volunteers to review the document? The latest version, right? Thanks, Neil. One or two more, maybe? Please, one more. Come on, one more. Well, we're gonna call for a work group last call, so we expect people to actually review the document, hopefully. So can we get at least one more volunteer to review the document? Okay, awesome. And what's your full name? Sorry.
It's Tiloshan Nagarajat. I'll type in the chat.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, awesome.
I've got it in the minutes.
Okay, awesome, good. Okay, perfect. Good.
Maybe just to
Yep.
answer the question or provide some insight, all you need to do is review it, and if there are problems that you see, raise them in the last call by sending an email to the working group, pointing out the issues and hopefully offering solutions if possible. Or if you don't find problems, simply saying I've reviewed the document and it looks okay is also very helpful. So that's all there is to it.
You understood.
Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Okay, good. Well, thank you all. Anything else? Any other business? Awesome. Okay, good. Then I think we're done here today. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Let's see. Okay. Bye, guys.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.